My name is Ethan Carter, and I thought buying 40 acres of quiet countryside would finally free me from neighborhood politics. The property sat just outside a growing town, far enough from the noise but close enough to rising land values. For years, I kept the place untouched, treating it as a long-term investment while enjoying the peace that came with owning open land. Then a newly elected HOA president everyone called Karen became obsessed with turning the surrounding area into what she described as a luxury community destination. What happened next still sounds unreal to me. Without my approval, meetings were held, plans were drawn, and announcements were made about a massive project that was supposedly coming to my land. Somehow, people started believing construction was imminent. Investors celebrated. Local officials smiled for cameras. Karen took credit for everything. There was just one tiny problem nobody bothered to address. I still owned the property. And when the grand opening date finally arrived, the entire scheme collapsed in front of hundreds of people. Bro, the fallout that followed was unlike anything I had ever seen. The ribbon-cutting ceremony never happened, and that was only the beginning. The whole situation started so quietly that I almost missed it. At the time, I was living a few hours away from the property and only visited every couple of weeks. The land itself was simple, 40 acres of open fields, a small wooded section near the back, and a creek running along one edge. There were no buildings, no businesses, and no development plans. I liked it that way. It was an investment, not a project. My goal was straightforward: hold the property for a few years and decide later whether to sell or build. The surrounding area, however, was changing fast. Two developers had started buying nearby parcels. New homes appeared every few months. Property values climbed. Local business owners began talking about tourism, retail expansion, and community growth. Whenever people saw empty land, they immediately started imagining ways to use it. That's exactly where Karen entered the story. Karen had recently become president of the local HOA that managed one of the larger residential communities bordering my property. From what I later learned, she loved attention. She wasn't satisfied with maintaining roads or handling neighborhood complaints. She wanted to leave a legacy. Apparently, she saw my land as the perfect opportunity. The first sign that something was wrong came from a phone call I received from a real estate agent asking whether construction timelines were still on schedule. I had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. At first, I assumed he had the wrong number. Then he mentioned a mixed-use development project. Then he mentioned retail space. Then walking trails. Then event venues. Then a visitor center. The more he talked, the more confused I became. I owned the property, and none of those things existed. After hanging up, I started making calls. Within a few hours, I discovered something that genuinely blew my mind. Karen had been publicly presenting a development concept that included my land as the centerpiece. Not land she owned. Not land controlled by the HOA. My land. Even crazier, she wasn't presenting it as an idea. She was presenting it as an upcoming reality. Community newsletters featured artist renderings. Social media pages discussed future attractions. Local groups shared maps. People were debating parking layouts and landscaping plans for a project that had never even been discussed with me. Bro, hearing that felt like stepping into an alternate universe. How do you announce a major development on someone else's property without ever speaking to the owner? But somehow, that's exactly what had happened. The deeper I looked, the stranger things became. Karen had convinced several community committees that the project was essentially guaranteed. She described it as a partnership effort designed to increase property values throughout the area. Residents loved the idea. Businesses loved the idea. Everyone loved the idea because they assumed all the difficult legal details had already been resolved. Nobody seemed interested in verifying that assumption. Meanwhile, Karen continued building momentum. Every month, the plans grew larger. What started as a small recreation concept became a sprawling destination project. New amenities appeared in presentations. Additional facilities appeared in drawings. Future expansion phases were discussed as if they were already funded. And through all of it, nobody contacted me. I eventually attended one of the public planning meetings myself. I didn't announce who I was. I simply sat in the audience and listened. That meeting remains one of the most surreal experiences of my life. People spoke passionately about the future of my property. They discussed timelines, budgets, construction phases, expected attendance, economic benefits, potential ribbon-cutting ceremonies. The entire room acted as though the project was already moving forward. Meanwhile, the actual owner was sitting 10 feet away wondering how everyone had become so confident. What shocked me most wasn't Karen's behavior. It was the number of people willing to believe her. Confidence can be incredibly persuasive. When someone speaks with certainty, others often stop asking questions. That's exactly what happened here. Karen projected absolute confidence. She behaved like a person who already had authority. And because nobody challenged her claims early, the story kept growing. By the end of that meeting, local excitement had reached a level that was honestly dangerous. For investors were expressing interest. Businesses were planning around future traffic. Community leaders were discussing launch events. Some people were even talking about a grand ribbon-cutting ceremony scheduled for the following year. And sitting there in the back row, I realized something important. Karen hadn't just created a misunderstanding. She had built an entire public narrative around property she didn't own. The bigger that narrative became, the harder the eventual collapse was going to be. What I didn't know yet was that Karen was about to take things much further, and the consequences would soon become impossible for anyone to ignore. Over the next several months, the situation spiraled far beyond what I thought was possible. Instead of slowing down after I quietly began asking questions, Karen doubled down. Every new community meeting seemed bigger than the last. More promotional materials appeared online. Local newspapers started mentioning the proposed project as if it were an inevitable part of the town's future. The rumors became so widespread that complete strangers began contacting me, assuming I was involved in the development. The irony was unbelievable. I owned every square foot of the land, yet somehow I was the last person anyone expected to hear from. At first, I considered publicly correcting the record. A simple statement could have ended everything immediately. But the more I observed, the more I realized something important. Karen wasn't merely making assumptions anymore. She was actively building expectations. She had attached her reputation to the project. Community leaders had attached their reputations to it. Local businesses had started making decisions based on it. The entire thing had become a house of cards. And every week, they added another floor. Then came the moment that changed everything. A friend forwarded me an announcement for what was described as a preliminary groundbreaking celebration. It wasn't official construction, but it was being marketed as a major milestone toward the future development. Promotional images showed smiling families, walking paths, retail concepts, and event spaces spread across land that was still legally mine. Bro, I stared at that announcement for several minutes wondering if it was real. It was. Karen had moved beyond presentations and wishful thinking. She was now organizing public events around a project that had absolutely no legal right to exist. That's when I stopped watching from the sidelines. Instead of arguing publicly, I hired a land use attorney and began documenting everything. Every newsletter. Every online post. Every public presentation. Every map. Every statement that implied ownership, permission, or approval. The evidence stack grew quickly. Meanwhile, Karen seemed completely unaware that a storm was approaching. The biggest shock arrived a few weeks later when invitations were distributed for an official ribbon-cutting ceremony scheduled the following spring. Local officials were expected to attend. Business leaders were invited. Community members were encouraged to celebrate the beginning of what was being promoted as a transformative project for the area. There was just one problem. No permits existed. No agreements existed. No contracts existed. And most importantly, no permission existed. Yet hundreds of people were now marking their calendars. Watching it unfold felt surreal. The closer the event came, the more confident Karen became. But confidence couldn't change property records, legal ownership, or reality itself. The countdown had started. And when ribbon-cutting day finally arrived, the collision between fantasy and reality was going to be spectacular. 6. The morning of the ribbon-cutting ceremony arrived with perfect weather and absolute confidence from everyone involved, except me. By the time I reached the property, hundreds of people had gathered near a temporary stage. Banners were hanging everywhere. Vendors were setting up booths. Local officials were shaking hands. Karen was moving through the crowd like a celebrity taking credit for a project she believed was finally becoming reality. What nobody knew was that my attorney and I had spent the previous weeks preparing for this exact moment. Just before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, certified notices were delivered to event organizers, local officials, and every company publicly participating in the project. The documents made one thing crystal clear: I was the legal owner of the property, no development rights had ever been granted, and no authorization had ever existed for the event or the proposed project. The reaction was immediate. Confusion turned into panic. Phones came out. Conversations stopped. Officials began leaving. Sponsors quietly disappeared. Within minutes, the celebration atmosphere completely collapsed. Then came the final blow. Property records, ownership documents, and attorney statements were displayed for everyone to review. The facts were undeniable. The stage sat empty. The ribbon remained uncut. And Karen's massive project died right there in front of the crowd before a single shovel ever touched the ground. The ceremony never happened. The reality check finally arrived. The fallout lasted for months. Once the truth became public, community support vanished almost overnight. Businesses distanced themselves from the project, local officials denied involvement, and investors quickly backed away. Several residents demanded answers about how such a massive plan had moved forward without basic verification of ownership. 7. Karen's reputation took the hardest hit. The same people who once praised her leadership now questioned every decision she had made. HOA meetings became tense, and before long, she stepped away from her position entirely. As for me, I kept the property. Ironically, its value increased anyway, just without Karen's imaginary project. Looking back, this whole story proves how far confidence can carry a bad idea when nobody stops to verify the facts. Bro, what shocked me most wasn't the failed project, it was how many people accepted fiction as reality. In the end, ownership mattered, facts mattered, and karma showed up right on schedule.